Hi everyone, this is Professor Smith, and this video is going to be a continuation of our study of costs. And in this video, we're going to look at how we numerically calculate all these measures, and we're going to do it in a nice table format here. So for this video, you'll want to have the firm production and cost Excel worksheet open. You'll want to have reviewed the definitions of fixed variable total, marginal, average, in the short run cost example tab, and then you'll want to scroll over to the tab that says cost practice. So this is an example where you have a firm, and I've given us some introductory data, and we want to just basically practice with determining all the measures of cost and profits that we've learned so far. So this firm has fixed cost of $30. It has variable cost of $10 per worker, so we could think of that, for example, as the average wage rate that this firm is paying. And just for simplicity, we'll assume no other variable cost. Of course, in the real world, you might have materials expenses as well. And this firm is going to sell its product to the customer at a price of $2 per unit. Okay, now what I've given us in the table are these two starter columns that tell us, as a function of how many workers are being hired, so that would be L for labor, what is the corresponding quantity produced that in total the firm would expect to produce. So for example, if this firm hired one worker, that firm would produce 50 units total. If this firm instead hired, let's say, 4 workers, the total production of the 4 workers would be 140 units. Okay, so that's how you interpret that table using the textbooky terminology. That's called the production function. Now, what we're going to practice calculating is the marginal productivity of this firm's labor. Okay, so if you guys remember from the definition, again, go back and take a look at short run cost example. Conceptually, marginal means incremental or change, and we simply look at the change in something divided by the change in something else. Okay, now it's a little bit different when you're talking about what we call the marginal product, and I'm going to be precise here and call it of labor. It's going to be the change in quantity produced divided by the change in the number of workers. Now I can't go from -1 workers to 0 as my change, so I have to start with an NA, not applicable. All right, let's take a look at the first worker. The change in quantity would be 50 minus 0. Okay, so that's the incremental production generated by that one worker. And I simply divide that by the change in the amount of labor. Okay, so I went from 0 to 1, so I'm simply going to use a subtraction to measure the change. So it's literally increments, and you just simply do subtractions like this. Okay, so that first worker, contributed 50 additional units. Now if I drag this down using the power of Excel, I can see that, for example, the second worker contributed 40 additional units because the total went from 50 units produced up to 90. So that's a change of 40. Okay, so hopefully you guys now algebraically see the pattern here. The third worker, I just simply look at the change in quantity. That's a change of 30. All right, so that's what we call the marginal product of the third worker, for example. All right, now let's go on to the next column. What do I put here, brain teaser? Do I put NA? No, I don't put NA because when the firm is producing nothing, and even if it's hiring no workers, does it still have fixed cost? Yes. Right? So even at a production quantity of 0, we believe that the firm incurs fixed cost. Okay, so I'm simply going to cell reference that, and then using the power of Excel, I'm going to lock that cell down, And the fixed cost is not going to change as the quantity changes. It's going to always be 30. Okay, so that's what it means to say something is a fixed cost numerically. Whether I produce nothing, the fixed cost is 30. If I produce 120, the fixed cost is 30. If I produce 150, the fixed cost is 30. Okay, let's move on to variable cost. In this case, the only variable cost is the labor. I have a per worker rate, so I would simply have to multiply, so that's W for wage, and I would simply have to multiply that by the amount of labor that's being hired. Okay, so I could just do equals $10 per worker. That's going to be my approximate wage rate, and I'm going to lock that cell down and simply multiply by the number of workers. So in the first row here, there is no variable cost because no workers are yet hired. Now if I simply drag down, right, I can see it kind of makes sense. When I have one worker hired at $10 per worker, my total variable is 10. If I hire two workers at $10 a worker, my total variable is 20, and on and on. All right, now total, again, go back and look at your definition. Total is simply the sum of fixed and variable. Okay, so I'm going to do equal fixed plus variable. All right, drag that down. Okay, boom, done with that column. Now just for some practice, let's figure out the firm's profit. Total revenue would be price per unit times quantity sold, so that's the left-hand side of the profit equation, that would be revenue. And now simply subtract off the corresponding total cost. So that's literally just total revenue minus total cost. Okay, so we can see that this firm is losing money if it doesn't produce anything, and in this example, its profit is increasing. Eventually, if I had a longer table, that profit would max out and then would actually start to decline. All right, let's take a look at our last two categories, and then we are done. Average cost is simply total cost per unit. In other words, total cost divided by the quantity being produced. Now, what's going to happen if I run this? Total cost divided by quantity from high school algebra. That's going to throw an error because you cannot divide by 0. So really that should be an NA. I'm just going to keep it there because the formula is okay. So if I drag this down, and let me format these with a $sign. Okay, let's take a look at the first one. The average total cost of the 50 units, okay, is 80 cents per unit. That's how you interpret that, the average cost. Not every unit costs that exact amount. It's like the representative cost of that batch, of a unit within that total. Okay, if this firm increases production to 90 in total, the average cost of all the units would be 56 cents per unit. Notice how it tends to decrease, and then it kind of bottoms out, and then it will start to steadily increase. So it's kind of got this U-shaped pattern if you were to graph it. Lastly, we have marginal. Marginal cost is simply, again, going back to our definition, change in total cost divided by change in quantity. Okay, now again, I look at my denominator, change in quantity. I've got a 0 here. I can't go from negative units to 0. So I'm going to start out with an NA. All right, let's take a look at row number 1. The change in cost, again, is simply just the subtraction, the difference. Okay, so I'm going to do 40 minus 30. That's the change in total cost. And I'm then going to divide that by the change in quantity. again, just a simple subtraction. Okay, so notice how my marginal is not equal to the average. Typically, that only occurs at 1 point for every firm. Okay. Now, if I drag this down, what do I notice is happening? The marginal cost is starting to accelerate pretty fast. And in fact, it's exactly equal to average total cost in this row here. And then it starts to pull ahead or become higher than average total cost. And that's what drives the ATC upward. So that's actually a pretty thorough numerical overview of how you run these. Just kind of one other trick of the trade. In some homework problems that you might come across, it's good to be able to algebraically arrange the sum of these. So as an example, we know average total is total cost divided by quantity. I might be given average total cost and quantity, and I want to figure out the total cost. Now, that row and the row above, guys, are exactly the same. That's just simply an algebraic change around. So, for example, let's suppose my average total cost, let's take a look at row 4, for example. Okay. My average total is 50 cents multiplied by 140 units would give me back 70 as a total cost. Okay, so don't be afraid to use a little bit of algebra to rearrange these equations to help you get the answer that you need.